The man who wrote the official story of this disaster was called, in his own lifetime, the most brilliant mind alive. His name was Michael Psellos, philosopher, kingmaker, a courtier who could compose a man's political obituary while the man still breathed. From his desk in the imperial palace in Constantinople, he shaped the definitive account of the Emperor Romanos Diogenes, a vain fool, a reckless amateur, a general who marched the armies of the Roman Empire straight into ruin. Psellos wrote it with elegance, and his version has governed the story for 1,000 years. It is also a lie built on purpose. There was a second Michael who wrote about that day, Michael Attaleiates, not a philosopher, a judge. And he was there. He rode with the army. He tasted the dust of the march. He watched the betrayal with his own eyes. His chronicle is not polished propaganda from a warm palace. It is the testimony of a witness to a killing that began with ink and was only finished later with a needle. On August 26, 1071, something happened that had not happened in nearly 1,000 years of Roman warfare. An emperor was taken alive on the battlefield by a foreign enemy. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan held the most powerful man in Christendom in his hands, and he treated him as a king. He gave him a seat at his side. He negotiated a treaty that cost the empire no land. He sent him home under armed escort, weighed down with gifts. Romanos Diogenes came back not as a broken slave, but as a monarch carrying peace. The problem was that the men he had left in charge did not want peace. They wanted him erased. The Sultan honored him as a rival emperor. His own officials declared him a public enemy. They pronounced him deposed. They raised armies to hunt him across his own provinces. And when he was finally cornered, they threw out every term of his surrender. The foreign conqueror showed him mercy. His own people showed him none. This is not the story of how a battle was lost. It is the story of how an empire was taken apart from the inside, one decision at a time. The defeat at Manzikert was a wound, not a death. The Roman state had survived far worse and clawed itself back. The true catastrophe was not the blunder on the field. It was the calculation made in the capital. The men who ruled from the gilded halls of Constantinople had come to fear their own emperor more than any army beyond the frontier. A general who won was not a savior to them. He was a rival. And to pull that one man off the throne, they were willing to shatter the army, abandon the border, and set fire to the house they were sworn to guard. The loss of the empire's heartland was not an accident of war. It was a choice. Tell us which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The official history says he was a fool. That single word runs through every page Michael Psellos wrote about Romanos Diogenes, a blunt soldier, an arrogant provincial who reached above his station, a man whose ambition swallowed his talent whole. It is a portrait drawn with real skill, and it has convinced readers for 1,000 years. But there is a crack in it, and once you see the crack, the whole picture falls apart. If Romanos Diogenes was such an obvious fool, why did the cleverest men in Constantinople hand him the empire themselves? Psellos was one of them. He helped set the crown on the head of a man he later called a rustic clown. That is not the behavior of people fooled by a brute. That is the behavior of people who thought they had found a tool, a weapon they could aim at the frontier, and then set down when they were finished with it. Their mistake was simple. They forgot that a weapon shaped like a man can decide for itself where it wants to point. To see the trap they built, you have to see the machine that ran the Eastern Roman Empire. For 50 years before Romanos wore the purple, the state had been captured, not by a foreign army, by its own civil service, a government of aristocrats, eunuchs, and scholars who had convinced themselves that the deadliest threat to their world was not a Turkic horseman on the eastern border. It was a Roman general with a loyal army standing behind him. The logic was cold, and it was consistent. An army strong enough to hold the frontier was an army strong enough to march on Constantinople and throw out a dynasty. They had watched it happen. Only 16 years earlier, in 1057, the general Isaac Komnenos had done exactly that, marching his eastern troops on the capital and forcing the reigning emperor to abdicate into a monastery. The palace men did not forget the lesson. They drew the wrong conclusion from it. Instead of trusting their soldiers, they decided to break them. What followed was not neglect. It was a program, carried out over decades, deliberately, one budget line at a time. They starved the professional soldiers of money. Constantine Doukas, who reigned from 1059 to 1067, made it a policy. Psellos, who served at his elbow, praised the economies. The emperor cut the military rolls and let the frontier fortresses of Armenia and Mesopotamia decay behind their own gates. The great border city of Ani, taken from the Armenians in 1045, was left thinly held. In 1064, it fell to the Seljuks under Alp Arslan. Contemporary accounts describe the churches of that city emptied and its people scattered across the roads. The men in Constantinople balanced their ledgers and called it prudence. They dismantled the old thematic system, the arrangement where free farmers held their land in exchange for military service, generation after generation. Those soldier farmers were the spine of the empire's defense. The bureaucrats converted them into taxpayers. The men who had guarded the borders for centuries were disarmed and turned into a revenue stream. In their place came mercenaries, and from the desk of a palace official, mercenaries were perfect. Think about why. Mercenaries cost money, which kept them tied to the paymasters in the capital. They were foreign, which meant they felt nothing for some ambitious general dangling promises of land and titles. They fought for coin, not for a commander, not for a homeland. A man like Psellos looked at that arrangement and saw balance. An army weak enough to control, yet in theory, still strong enough to swat away a border raid. The theory failed because the raids stopped being small. The Seljuk Turks were not a disorganized swarm. They were a rising power, a new sultanate binding together Persia and Mesopotamia under one authority. Their leader, Alp Arslan, whose name meant the heroic lion, had inherited the throne from his uncle Tugrul in 1063 and spent every year since expanding it. His vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, one of the great administrators of the age, gave the Sultanate the order and the treasury that Constantinople was busy throwing away. His raiding columns grew bolder every season. In 1067 they struck deep into Cappadocia and sacked Caesarea, stripping the shrine of St. Basil of its silver. The empire's heartland was bleeding out slowly. Farm by farm and town by town, the rigged system built to keep generals harmless was now failing at the one job it still had to perform. The bureaucracy needed a soldier. They just needed a soldier they could hold on a leash. This is where Romanos Diogenes walks in, not as a rescuer, as the answer to a political problem. and the leash they chose was an object, a marriage contract. In late 1067, Constantine Doukas died. He left his wife, the Empress Eudokia Makrembolitissa, as regent for their young sons, and, according to Attaleiates, made her swear a written oath never to remarry, an oath deposited in the archives of Hagia Sophia under the guard of the Patriarch. The Doukas family, steered by the powerful Caesar John, the dead emperor's brother, meant to rule the empire through her. But the crisis in the east demanded a man on a horse at the head of an army, and Eudokia could not be that man. So the Doukas clan needed a military caretaker, a temporary emperor consort who would beat back the Turks, and then, the work done, quietly step aside and leave the throne clear for the rightful heir, the young Michael VII. Romanos fit the mold too well, a respected general from a powerful Cappadocian family. His own father, Constantine Diogenes, had been a distinguished commander before him, and had died accused of conspiracy against an earlier emperor, thrown from a tower, or leaping from it before the sentence came. Treason ran in the bloodline like a warning. Romanos was popular with the soldiers, proven on the frontier, and in 1067 he had been arrested and dragged to the capital in chains for allegedly plotting a coup of his own. That made him both qualified for the job and easy to threaten. Attaleiates, who saw him then, describes a man brought before the court expecting the executioner. Instead, Eudokia looked at him and chose him. They pulled him out of prison. They pardoned him. On the first day of January, 1068, in the Great Palace, she married him and made him emperor. The empress had broken her written oath to do it, and the Patriarch John Xiphilinos had to be persuaded to release her from it, a release he later regretted signing. Some said she had loved the tall Cappadocian from the moment she saw him condemned. Others said the state simply needed his sword. Both may be true. The wedding was a transaction, cold as the marble it was sworn on. Romanos gave his oath to defer always to Eudokia and her sons, to protect them, never to rival them. The contract was not the beginning of a new dynasty. It was a chain with a title attached. They called him emperor. The real power stayed with the Doukas clan and their allies in the civil government, and near the front of that group stood Michael Psellos, who had been tutor to the boy Michael VII and had no intention of watching his pupil pushed aside. From the moment the crown touched his head, Romanos was walking a wire stretched over a pit. He had one task: defeat the Turks. But success and failure were both fatal. Fail, and they would discard him as the incompetent they always said he was. Succeed, and he would become too popular, too dangerous, a hero at the head of veterans who might decide his oaths had expired. He would stop being a caretaker and become a real emperor. And a real emperor was the single outcome the Doukas family could not survive. Now watch the next 3 years through two sets of eyes that describe the same man and cannot agree on anything. In the pages of his Chronographia, Psellos writes with contempt. He shows a Romanos lost in the capital, a coarse soldier whose mind was as dull as a well-used blade. Psellos, the supreme intellectual snob, mocks his rough manners, his lack of polish, his plain religious faith. He recasts the emperor's tireless preparation as the obsession of a man who understood only force, a simpleton playing with the treasury and the legions. It is worth remembering what Psellos was. He had served 5 emperors before this. He had helped raise some to the throne and helped push others off it. He had once talked a dying emperor into signing away his choice of heir. He wrote his history to be read by the winners, and he made sure the winners came out clean. Then there is the other Michael Attaleiates, the judge who marched with him and wrote what he saw. Attaleiates shows a different person entirely. A commander fighting impossible odds. A man who spent 3 years crossing and recrossing Anatolia, leading campaigns in person. In 1068, he marched into Syria and retook the fortress of Hierapolis after a hard assault. In 1069, he pushed east again, hunting raiding columns across the Armenian highlands, where the summer dust choked the marching lines, and the winter passes closed like doors behind them. That year, his own rebel officer, the same Norman Roussel de Bailleul, nearly wrecked a campaign by abandoning his post, a preview of what hired swords would do when it suited them. He shows an emperor who ate the same rations as his troops, who slept in his armor beside them, who rode at the front of his own charges. The rustic Psellos sneered at was, in the field, a monarch grinding himself down, trying to reverse 50 years of decay. And he was doing it against a system built to make sure he could not. The armies handed to him were half-trained and underpaid. Attaleiates describes soldiers whose breastplates were rusted through, whose horses were broken-down nags, whose officers had bought their ranks and never drawn a sword in anger. He describes reviewing a body of native troops so neglected that they arrived without proper weapons, the descendants of the old thematic soldiers now reduced to ragged farmhands. The bureaucracy in Constantinople delayed his funds, second-guessed his strategy, salted his command staff with men whose real loyalty belonged to his rivals. Every step forward cost him twice, once against the Turks and once against his own capital. Which of these two Michaels do you believe? That is the whole question. One wrote from a warm desk with a career to protect. The other wrote from the saddle with dust in his throat. Keep both in mind, because in a few months, one of them will describe a betrayal, and the other will explain why it had to happen. By the spring of 1071, Romanos knew the clock was against him. The raids continued. His careful campaigns had pushed the Turks back without breaking them. The whispers in the capital were louder now, arranged by the Caesar John Doukas and dressed in the elegant sentences of Psellos. He needed something no rumor could twist. Not a skirmish, not a treaty. A victory so total, so undeniable, that it would end every argument at once and nail his claim to the throne. So he made his decision. He would gather the largest imperial army seen in generations and march east. He would corner the Sultan Alp Arslan and force a single battle where the winner took everything. The army left Constantinople in March of 1071, crossing the Bosphorus in a stream of ferries that took days to move the baggage alone. Attaleiates rode with it as a judge attached to the emperor's staff, and he recorded the mood on the road. It was not confident. On the march through Anatolia, a section of an old imperial palace where Romanos lodged for the night collapsed behind him as he left it. Men whispered it was an omen. His own tent caught fire another evening, and his favorite war horse bolted into the dark and was found only at dawn. A standard broke in a soldier's hands during a review, and the pole snapped clean at the grip. The troops watched these things and grew quiet. An army reads signs the way a sailor reads weather, and every reading came back the same. The host he had assembled was, in the end, a monument to the very system he was trying to save, and a warning he could not read in time. It was enormous. Some sources put it above 200,000 men, a number almost certainly invented to impress. A sober count lands somewhere between 40 and 70,000. But the size was the most dishonest thing about it. This was not one disciplined Roman army. It was a fragile patchwork, stitched from parts that did not trust one another. At its center stood what survived of the native Byzantine heavy infantry and the elite cavalry of the Tagmata. Real soldiers, but the bulk of the host was hired. Norman cavalry from Italy rode under the ambitious Roussel de Bailleul, men who had spent a decade cutting a private kingdom out of the empire's Italian provinces. They fought for Romanos. They did not fight for Rome. There were Frankish and German infantry contingents, and the Germans nearly came to blows with the emperor's officials over their pay before the walls of a border town. There was the Varangian Guard, axe-bearing Northmen who served the emperor's person directly and spoke a tongue no one else in the camp could read. And there were cavalry squadrons of Pechenegs and Oghuz Turks drawn from the northern steppes, horsemen who spoke the same language and shared the same customs as the enemy they were paid to kill. Picture what that meant on the day of battle. A command shouted in Turkic could be answered by men on both sides. This was a logistical nightmare, and a barrel of powder wearing the shape of an army. Feeding it alone required a baggage train that stretched for miles, ox carts groaning across the Anatolian plateau, where the water sources were days apart, and the grass burned brown by June. Rumors ran through the ranks that the Oghuz would desert the moment they smelled their kinsmen across the field. Romanos heard those rumors too, and he could do nothing but keep marching. And into that barrel, the Doukas faction had already set the fuse. The commander of the entire reserve, the anchor at the rear on which the whole formation depended, was Andronikos Doukas, the Caesar's own son, the very man who would inherit the throne if Romanos fell in the field. Read that again. The emperor's fate at the decisive moment would rest in the hands of the person with the most to gain from his death. Romanos knew it. He had asked for the young man to be placed under his eye rather than left behind to plot in the capital. He chose to keep his enemy close. It was the reasoning of a man who trusts a rope he can see over a knife he cannot. It would prove the worst decision of his life. If you believe history is not a tidy list of kings and battles, but a story of systems, betrayals, and the hard truths buried under the official record, then you already belong here. These are the stories we were built to tell. But documentaries this deep, free from censorship and free from easy simplification, survive only because of the people who stand behind them. When you join the Lineage, our membership club, you stop being a viewer and become part of the team, an insider who keeps these investigations alive. You keep the channel breathing, and in return, you get early access to every new film we make. If you are ready to go deeper, join the ranks. We are waiting for you. The march east continued under a slow-spreading poison. Romanos knew exactly what was moving against him back in Constantinople. He knew every delay would be magnified, every setback rewritten as proof of his failure, and passed along the marble corridors by Psellos and the Doukas clan. He was not only marching toward Alp Arslan, he was marching away from a coup that had already begun, one that was simply waiting, patient, for him to stumble. By August, the army reached the highlands near Lake Van, in what is now eastern Turkey, a country of bare ridges and thin, cold air where the horizon shakes with heat at noon and freezes hard by night. There, on a plain beside a fortress town called Manzikert, Romanos made a choice that would decide everything. He split his army. He sent a large portion south under a separate commander, the general Joseph Tarchaniot, to secure a second fortress at Kliat. Then he learned that the Sultan he believed to be far away in Aleppo was in fact close, very close, and the column he had sent south did not come back. Some accounts say it fled without a fight. Others say it was scattered before it ever reached the walls. He was betting everything on a single throw, deep in enemy country, with an army he could not fully trust, now cut in half, with his designated successor commanding the men at his back. A negotiated peace would be sold as cowardice. A careful retreat would be branded a rout. Only a victory beyond all denial could save his throne and his life. He did not yet know that the man holding his reserves had already been given a reason to let him die. And out beyond the ridgeline, unseen in the failing light, the heroic lion was watching the Roman camp count its fires. The story of Manzikert has 2 holes in it, not gaps a careful historian can patch. Silences. 2 moments where the record simply stops, and where the men who wrote it wanted it to stop. The first is a missing army. On the eve of the battle, a column of thousands of men under the General Joseph Tarquiniotes walks off the page and never comes back. Sent on a mission. Then nothing. No battle report. No death notice. Gone. The second is a single question that decided the future of a continent. When the imperial line was at its most exposed, did the reserve under Andronikos Doukas break and run in the dust like frightened men? Or did it turn and ride off the field on purpose, cold and deliberate, exactly as planned? The chronicles written by men loyal to the regime that came after are a fog of excuses stacked on contradictions. You will not find the truth in their sentences. You find it by asking one question they never wanted asked. Who profited from the confusion? Hold that question. Everything in this part answers it. The campaign opened as a parade of power. Romanos marched his patchwork army across Anatolia like a slow city built of iron and leather, reimposing Roman authority on a land carved up by years of raiding. He was careful, methodical. He restored order town by town, garrisoning strong points and rebuilding bridges the raiders had burned. His route ran east through Sebastia and Theodosiopolis, the last major Roman way station before the Armenian highlands, a town of thick walls and cold wells where the army watered before climbing onto the plateau. Attaleiates, riding in the column, noted the discipline breaking down even here. Mercenary bands looted a market. A German contingent nearly mutinied over pay and had to be surrounded and disarmed by the emperor's own guard. Along the road, the local Armenians, who resented the Greek emperor as much as they feared the Turks, gave the army no love and little food. In August 1071, Romanos reached his target, the fortress city of Manzikert on the high plain north of Lake Van. It fell fast, almost without a fight. The garrison, mostly Turkish, gave it up when they saw the size of the host below the walls. The ease of it was a trap dressed as a victory. The Sultan, his scouts told him, was hundreds of miles south, tied up with the siege of Edessa, or already gone toward Syria. Romanos believed he had time, so he made the decision that undid him. He split the army in 2. He would hold Manzikert with the eastern half. Tarquiniotes would take the western half, including the Norman cavalry under Roussel de Bailleul and the Pecheneg horse, and march on the nearby fortress of Akhlat on the far shore of the lake. On a map it was sound. Secure the whole region before the enemy could arrive. Standard doctrine taught in every Roman command tent for 300 years. But the enemy had already arrived. Byzantine intelligence had failed on a scale that is hard to measure. Alp Arslan was not in Syria. He had lifted the siege of Edessa, crossed the Euphrates, and force-marched his men north with a speed no Roman planner had allowed for. He stripped his column down to cavalry alone, leaving the infantry and the heavy baggage behind so his horsemen could cover ground the Romans thought no army could cover. Along the way, according to the Muslim chroniclers, he had his men put on white burial shrouds and led prayers as though they rode to certain death, and he tied his own horse's tail with his own hands, the gesture of a warrior who expected to fall. While Tarchenios rode toward Akhlat, he rode straight into the vanguard of the Sultan's host, and here the first silence swallows him. Attaleiates, who was in the emperor's half of the army, records the fact and nothing more. The western column was gone, and he never saw those men again. Historians writing decades later under the patronage of the Doukas family reach for vague words. Perhaps Tarchenios was beaten in a sharp fight. Perhaps he saw the size of the Sultan's army and chose to fall back all the way to Roman territory, hundreds of miles west, without sending a single rider to warn the emperor. There is a darker reading, and it fits the pattern that follows. Perhaps the commanders of that western column, several of them tied to the Doukas faction, simply took their share of the army and abandoned the emperor before the battle even began. Roussel the Norman, who deserted a campaign only 2 years earlier and would soon try to carve his own kingdom out of Anatolia, was riding with them. Men who leave once tend to leave again. Whatever the reason, the arithmetic was fixed. Romanos now faced the full Seljuk army with half of his own, and he may not have grasped how thin his position had become. Consider the man on the other side, because he did not want this fight at all. Alp Arslan's real ambition lay south in the conquest of Fatimid Egypt, the great prize of the Islamic world. His vizier, Nizam al-Mulk, had built the Sultanate around that goal. Its madrasas and its treasury all pointed at Cairo. A full war with the Roman Empire was a detour the Sultan had no use for. He was a pragmatist to the bone. When his scouts confirmed the size of the force at Manzikert, he did the sensible thing. He sent an embassy to the emperor's camp, led, some sources say, in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and offered a truce. Renew the old agreements, settle the frontier, let both rulers save face and turn their armies elsewhere. For the Sultan, it was clean statecraft. For Romanos, it was a noose. Picture his position. A truce would be carried back to Constantinople and rewritten by Psellos and the Doukas clan into a single word: failure. Proof that the great expedition, which had drained the treasury and emptied the frontier of every soldier it could scrape together, had bought nothing but a handshake. Romanos had staked his throne and his life on a victory so large no rumor could bend it. A negotiated peace gave him nothing to carry home. According to Attaleiates, he also distrusted the offer as a stalling trick, a way for the Sultan to buy time for reinforcements riding up from the south. So he sent the envoys away with a hard answer. His reply, he said, would be delivered on the field, and he told them he would discuss terms in the Sultan's own capital. The last exit closed behind him with those words. The night before, the battle was uneasy. Attaleiates records that a Byzantine foraging party stumbled into Seljuk skirmishers in the dark, and that a wave of panic swept part of the camp when men mistook the returning foragers for an enemy attack. Worse than the false alarm was the quiet desertion. The Oghuz mercenaries within the emperor's own army, steppe horsemen who spoke the enemy's language, began slipping away toward the Seljuk fires in the dark. Whole squadrons vanished before a single battle line was drawn. Their commander, a man named Thomas, went over with them. The emperor spent the night trying to steady an army that was bleeding men into the darkness, section by section. On the morning of Friday, August 26, 1071, the Byzantine army marched out of its camp in full battle order. At its center, taking the early sun, stood the object that held the whole formation together, the imperial standard, the great labarum, the sacred banner of the Christian empire, raised on a tall staff and ringed by the emperor's own Varangian guard, tall Northmen with long axes across their shoulders. That banner was the army's anchor. Every soldier on that plain could look toward it and know where the emperor stood. The line advanced in order, a wall of shields and spear points, the front rank locked and the standards spaced along it. Mercenary cavalry on the wings, and behind it all, held back in a second line, the vast reserve under Andronikos Doukas. They expected a pitched battle. Heavy infantry against heavy cavalry, the kind of collision where Roman discipline usually won. Arslan refused to give it to them. The Seljuks did not form a line to be broken. They swarmed, a loose crescent of horse archers strung out for miles, refusing to close. They would ride in, loose a volley, and wheel away before the heavy Byzantine cavalry could reach them. It was warfare designed to exhaust and enrage. The Sultan had drawn his center back and hidden fresh riders in the folds of the low hills that ringed the plain, feeding them into the fight in relays, so his men never tired while the Romans wore themselves down. For hours the Roman line pushed deeper into open country, chasing an enemy that thinned out and reformed like smoke every time they drew near. Arrows fell in slanting showers and rattled off the raised shields. Horses screamed and went down kicking, tangling the ranks behind them. The heat came off the burnt grass in waves, and the water was miles behind them in the camp. Stragglers on the flanks were picked off one by one, and the wounded were left where they fell as the line ground forward. Romanos, at the head of the center, drove on, hunting a decisive clash the Sultan had no intention of giving him. By late afternoon, the truth was plain. There would be no set-piece battle. The army stood far out on the plain, its camp a smudge on the horizon behind it. The men were spent and dry-mouthed under a falling sun that threw their shadows long across the ground. So Romanos made the only sound choice left to him. He ordered a halt. The imperial standard stopped. Then the signal went out for the whole line to reverse and march back to camp in formation, to reach water and safety before dark closed over the plain. This is the most dangerous order in all of warfare, and every officer on that field knew it. A disciplined withdrawal can collapse into a rout in the space of a few minutes, especially in a multinational army full of hired men whose first loyalty is to their own survival. The entire maneuver rested on one thing. The reserve line under Andronikos Doukas had to hold its ground, keep a solid face toward the enemy, and cover the main body as it pulled back. That was its only job. Stand fast and shield the retreat. Now the moment arrives that everything hinged on. As the great imperial standard began its slow move to the rear, a ripple ran through the ranks. Was this a controlled withdrawal, or was the emperor running? In the dust thrown up by thousands of turning horses and in the thinning red light, no ordinary soldier could tell. And at that exact instant of maximum doubt, the Seljuks, who had feigned flight all day, turned as one and charged. A horn sounded across the crescent. The full weight of the attack crashed onto the Byzantine wings, and in the same breath, the imperial reserve, the one force that could have steadied the whole army, turned its back and marched off the field. Here the voice of the man who was standing on that ground becomes everything. Michael Attaleiates does not hedge. He writes that Andronikos Doukas had long been an enemy of the emperor. He writes that Doukas looked at the chaos, spread a false rumor that the emperor was already dead, proclaimed that Romanos was in flight, and treacherously abandoned him. No fog, no misread signal, a deliberate act of treason named by a witness who watched it happen a few hundred yards away, and had every reason to fear naming it in writing under the dynasty that rewarded the traitor. That Attaleiates wrote it down at all is itself a kind of courage, and it is why we trust his version over the flattery that came later. The versions written decades later tell it differently. The court historians who served the next dynasty speak of poor visibility, of panic among the hired troops, of a tragic, understandable misreading of the emperor's orders in the dust. They build a careful fog of war to hide a political crime committed in the last light of day. But whichever version you believe, the outcome on the ground was not in doubt. The army's anchor was gone. Ask the question again now. Who profited from the confusion? The man who marched away that evening was the son of the Caesar John Doukas. He was the heir who would inherit the throne if Romanos fell. His father sat in Constantinople waiting. His pupil tutor Psellos sat beside the young Michael VII, pen ready. The confusion had a beneficiary, and the beneficiary was holding the reins of thousands of fresh troops as he turned them away from the fight. The sight of that entire second line walking off the field killed the army's will in an instant. The mercenaries on the wings saw the battle was lost and did not wait to die for a foreign emperor. The Norman cavalry cut their way out of the closing ring and rode clear into the dark. The Pecheneg and Hogu's horsemen on the far flank did the simplest thing of all. They changed sides, spurring in among their Turkic kinsmen to fall on the men who had paid them that morning. On the left, the general Nikephoros Bryennios fought to hold his wing together and was driven back with an arrow in his side, a man who would live to write his own account years later. On the right, Theodore Alyattes saw his flank crumble and was swept away with the rest. The Byzantine line did not so much break as dissolve. Within minutes, the emperor and the elite troops of the center were surrounded, a shrinking island of order in a sea of running men and circling horse. To feel the full weight of a betrayal like this, you cannot rely on the polished official histories alone. You have to go to the man who was there. The book at the heart of this part of our story is a masterpiece of first-hand testimony, the raw account of someone who watched the lies being built while the dust was still in the air. We have made that very book available to you now. Click the View Products button on your screen. Owning it is the closest you will come to standing on that plain and seeing what actually happened. And while you are there, look through the rest of the shelf. We have gathered a collection of dark memorabilia and themed relics made to bring this story, and others like it, into your own hands. Open the shop on your screen and see what waits there. The end came in the twilight. Romanos Diogenes fought on with his army breaking apart around him. He drew what was left of his household troops and the Varangian guard tight around the imperial standard, and made his stand there beneath the banner that had anchored the whole line all day. The chroniclers say he cut down many men with his own hand until his sword arm was slick to the wrist. An arrow drove through his hand. His horse was killed under him, and he fought on foot, wounded, refusing every call to surrender, until the sheer weight of the enemy closed over him. A Seljuk soldier, a slave in the Sultan's service named, in some accounts, as a man called Shadi, seized him in the crush without knowing who he was. The prisoner claimed at first to be a common officer. Only when he was dragged toward the Sultan's tent and a captured Byzantine courtier was made to look at him and fell weeping to the ground at the sight, did the Seljuks realize what they held. They had taken the Emperor of the Romans alive, the first such capture in almost 1,000 years of Roman war. 2 victories were won on that plain, and they belonged to different men. The Sultan had won a battle he never wanted to fight, at a cost he could count on his fingers, and he did not yet grasp how large a thing had fallen into his hands. And far away in the ranks, and farther still in the marble corridors of Constantinople, the emperor's own enemies had won a war without ever crossing swords with a single Turk. The Emperor of the Romans was a prisoner in a foreign camp, his wounded hand bound with cloth, his crown lost somewhere in the dark grass of the field. His throne stood empty, and the men who had emptied it were already reaching for it, riding hard for the capital with news they would bend to their own ends before anyone there even knew whether their emperor was alive or dead. Every telling of Manzikert loves the scene in the tent. It has become a set piece, polished by 1,000 retellings into a moment of chivalry in a hard age. The captive emperor is brought before the Sultan. He is barefoot, his imperial robes stripped away, and the Muslim chroniclers say Alp Arslan made him kiss the ground and pressed a boot to his neck before raising him up again. Then the Sultan asks him what he would have done had the roles been reversed and Romanos held the Sultan as prisoner. Romanos answers like the soldier he is. He says he would have had him killed. The Sultan's reply became famous. His own punishment, he said, would be heavier. He would forgive him, and he did. He sat the emperor at his own table for a week. He sent the Emperor of the Romans home not in chains, but with an honor guard and a company of his own Turkish soldiers as escort. He sent him with a treaty that took no land, no fortresses, only a ransom, later reduced when the empire could not pay, a yearly tribute, the return of Seljuk captives, and a marriage alliance between their 2 houses. It was the mildest settlement a defeated Roman emperor had ever put his name to. If that were the end, Manzikert would be a footnote, a hard day on a distant plain, settled by 2 rulers like gentlemen. So how did one battle empty Anatolia of Rome forever? Because the treaty was ink on a page, and the government that was supposed to honor it had already branded the man who signed it an enemy of the state, weeks before he rode back through the gates of his own empire. Romanos returned to a country that no longer knew him. While he had been sitting across from the Sultan, the men he left behind had been staging their coup, and they had done it with the calm of surgeons. The Caesar John Doukas and his tutor of record Michael Psellos moved in a straight line. When the first rumor reached the capital that the emperor was a prisoner, they acted before any confirmation arrived. They forced the Empress Eudokia, Romanos' own wife, to give up power, then packed her off to a convent she had founded herself, her signature on the abdication pulled out of her under threat. Attaleiates says the palace guards, the same men sworn to her, turned on her at the Caesar's word. They crowned her son, their nephew, as sole emperor, Michael Attaleiates Doukas, a young man who preferred grammar and theology to government, who earned the mocking nickname Parapinakes, the man who cheated you of a quarter because the currency debased and the price of grain rose during his reign while he sat studying rhetoric with Psellos. He was a hand inside the Doukas glove and nothing more. Then, from the palace, they issued the decree that mattered. Romanos Diogenes was a usurper, a traitor who had bargained with the enemy to save his own skin. His treaty was void, and the armies of the empire were ordered not to march east against the Turks, but to hunt down the emperor who had just spent 3 years bleeding to defend them. The civil war had begun, and it would cost the empire everything the battle had not. What unfolded in 1072 was not a war so much as a state eating its own body. Romanos, freed by a sultan who had honored him, now found the roads home closed by his own government. He gathered the few loyalists who would still stand with him, some of the eastern themes, and a body of Armenian troops under the general Khachatur, and tried to fight his way back toward the capital. The Doukas regime held the treasury, and gold buys soldiers. They sent an army against him under Andronikos Doukas, the same man who had turned his back at Manzikert, now promoted and rewarded for his treason with high command. Here is where the true catastrophe begins, and it has nothing to do with the plain at Manzikert. The real disaster was the decade that followed, a slow demolition of the empire's foundations carried out by Romans, one payment at a time. Every ambitious general in the Byzantine world had just learned a lesson. Power in the empire was now for sale, and the coin it was priced in was Turkish cavalry. The Doukas regime hired Turkish warbands to fight Romanos. The men around Romanos hired other Turkish warbands to fight the Doukas Turks. Then other generals, watching from their provinces with an eye on the throne, did the same. Roussel de Bailleul, the Norman who had ridden off the field, carved out his own rebel state in central Anatolia around Ankara, and even proclaimed the aged John Doukas emperor as a puppet, and he had to be put down with, of all things, more Turkish mercenaries hired by a young officer named Alexios Komnenos, who would one day wear the crown himself. The frontier the Roman state had spent 700 years defending was thrown open, not by a Seljuk invasion, but by Roman commanders sending invitations across the border. Watch how the machine actually ran, because the mechanics are the whole horror of it. A Byzantine commander would open the gate of a Roman city and welcome a Turkish chieftain inside. He would pay him a fortune in gold to ride out and smash a rival Roman army camped before some other Roman town. The battle would end, and then the Turks, having seen the wealth stacked behind those walls and the divisions among the men who held them, would look at each other and ask a simple question: why ride home a paid sword when you could stay and become a lord of the land? Anatolia was not conquered in a great campaign. It was sold, field by field, town by town, by Romans paying Turks to kill other Romans, and never noticing that the buyers were quietly becoming the owners. Sit with the irony of it. The bureaucrats of Constantinople had feared one strong emperor more than any foreign army. To be rid of that one man, they broke the army, voided the peace, and unleashed a generation of civil war. In their terror of an invasion, they claimed Romanos was too incompetent to stop. They manufactured the invasion themselves. They opened the door and invited the wolf in to help settle a family quarrel. The wolf found the house warm, the larder full, and the family too busy fighting each other to notice him settling by the fire. He saw no reason ever to leave. The last act of Romanos Diogenes played out against this backdrop of a state killing itself. He fought on for months, a ghost of an emperor at the head of a shrinking column, marching through the very provinces he had once sworn to guard, past towns that had cheered him 3 years before and now bolted their gates against him. He was the better general, and he proved it, beating back the first force sent against him near Nicaea. But skill does not beat a treasury. He could not win a war of attrition against the bottomless coffers of the capital. His Armenian allies began to slip away in the night. In the end, He was cornered in the fortress of Adana, in Cilicia, in the far south, in the shadow of the Taurus Mountains, where the passes he might have escaped through were already held against him. Outnumbered, no relief coming from any quarter, he agreed to surrender, but not blindly, and not for nothing. He was still, in his own eyes and in the eyes of God, the anointed emperor. So he demanded a written guarantee for his life, and he got one, sworn upon by 3 metropolitans, the senior bishops of Chalcedon, Heraclea, and Colonaea, traveling with the Doukas army for exactly this purpose. The document promised, in the name of God and of the Emperor Michael that no harm would touch his person. He would be allowed to withdraw, unmolested, into a monastery and live out his days as a monk. Trusting that oath, sealed by 3 bishops of his own church, Romanos Diogenes laid down his arms and took the monastic habit, shaving his head, thinking he had bought his life with his crown. The men in Constantinople had never meant to keep it. A promise sworn on a battlefield was, to them, an inconvenience to be filed away and forgotten. The order that came back from the palace was not for a quiet retirement in a cell. It was for mutilation. The object that decided the fate of Romanos was not a sword, it was a needle. Blinding was the empire's chosen instrument for exactly this kind of problem, a way to disqualify a rival from the throne without the open sin of murder. The logic ran straight through the theology of the court. An emperor was held to be a living image of Christ on earth, and so his body had to be whole and unmarked. A blinded man could never wear the crown again. He was removed from the game without a corpse to bury, and a martyr for the crowds to mourn over. The order did not come from a foreign sultan in a rage. It came from cultured civil servants in the gilded chambers of the great palace, men who could quote scripture and balance a ledger in the same afternoon. It was, in the end, an administrative decision, drafted and sealed like a ruling on a land tax. The man who watched what followed was the judge Michael Attaleiates, and here his flat chronicler's voice finally breaks. He does not write like a historian keeping his distance. He writes like a witness to a crime he cannot forgive and dares not fully name, working under the very dynasty that ordered it. He records that the sentence was carried out with brutal incompetence by a man with no skill for the work, and that it was meant to inflict suffering rather than to remove a threat cleanly. The camera turns away from the room. What Attaleiates leaves on the page is the aftermath, and the aftermath is enough. Romanos, he says, bore it in silence, without begging. Then the broken man was set on a boat and carried across the water to a monastery on the island of Prote, one of the small prince's islands scattered in the Sea of Marmara, close enough to the capital that on a clear morning a whole man could have seen the domes he once ruled from. The wounds turned septic in the summer heat. He was left to die slowly over days on that small island within sight of the shore, his head swollen and fevered, tended by monks who could do nothing but change the cloths and wait. And then came the final cruelty, and it arrived in writing. Before the end, Romanos received a letter from his old enemy, the philosopher Michael Psellos. It was a note of congratulation. Psellos praised God that the emperor's earthly eyes had been taken from him so that he might now perceive the light of heaven with the eyes of the soul. The same pen that had painted him a fool for 1,000 years of readers signed off with a theological blessing over the ruin it had helped arrange. Historians have long suspected Psellos wrote it to bury his own hand in the deed under a performance of piety. A few days later, Romanos Diogenes was dead. He was buried on the island, far from the imperial tombs of his predecessors, and his fallen wife Eudokia is said to have paid, years later, for a proper stone to mark him. He did not die of the wound he took at Manzikert. He survived the battle. He survived the Sultan who might have killed him and chose mercy instead. He died of the peace his own rivals forced on him, on an island a morning's sail from the throne he had brought home safe. A decade, that is the number that carries the whole story. 10 years was all it took for one act of political vengeance to become permanent. With Romanos dead and the Doukas regime proving unable to hold a border it had never valued, Anatolia slid into chaos. The Turkish warlords, once paid guests riding home with saddlebags of gold, became the masters of the land. The great cities went one after another. Caesarea, where the raiders had once only passed through, now fell for good. Iconium became a Turkish seat. Antioch, Roman, since before there was a Rome in the east, was lost within the decade. Refugees streamed west toward the coast and the capital, and the recruiting grounds that had filled the legions for centuries emptied of Roman farmers. By 1081, a new and permanent Turkish state stood in the heart of the old Roman provinces, the Sultanate of Rûm. The name itself was a wound. Rûm meant Rome. The Turks were now calling their own kingdom by the name of the empire they had swallowed. Its capital was Nicaea. Understand what that name means. Nicaea was not some remote frontier outpost that could be crossed off a ledger and forgotten. It was a city so deep inside the Roman and Christian world that it had hosted the first ecumenical council of the Church in AD 325, where the bishops of the empire wrote the creed that Christians still recite word for word. It sat less than 100 miles from the walls of Constantinople, across a narrow strip of water. A rider could reach the capital in a matter of days. The loss of Anatolia, the demographic and economic heart of the empire for 7 centuries, its chief recruiting ground and its breadbasket, was now finished. So place the two dates side by side because they are not the same date, and the distance between them is the whole point of this story. The defeat on the field in 1071 did not seal the fate of the Eastern Roman Empire. That was a wound, and the empire had survived worse and clawed its way back from worse. The fate of the empire was sealed in a dark room in the summer of 1072, when the government in Constantinople chose to blind its own defeated emperor rather than close ranks behind him and honor the generous peace he had carried home. That single act of calculated cruelty broke the army, shattered the legitimacy of the state, and lit a generation of civil war that sold the empire's heartland to its enemies, one contract at a time. And the last turn of the story is the sharpest of all. Decades later, another emperor, Alexios Komnenos, the same young officer who had once hired Turks to crush the Norman rebel Roussel, stood on the walls of Constantinople as a grown ruler and looked out at Turkish-held land that began almost at his gate. He wanted those provinces back, the ones his predecessors had thrown away to settle a palace grudge. So he wrote west to Pope Urban II in Rome and asked for a modest force of Western mercenaries to help him push the border back a little. What answered his letter was not a few hundred hired swords. It was the First Crusade, tens of thousands of armed Westerners pouring across his lands in 1096, men he could barely feed and could not command, men with their own ambitions who would carve out their own principalities, from Antioch to Jerusalem, and answer to no emperor. The court of Constantinople had feared its own general so deeply that in destroying him it opened the door to the Turks, And in straining to shut that door again, it opened a far larger one, onto 2 centuries of holy war that would end in 1204 with a crusader army storming and sacking Constantinople itself, stripping the churches Psellos had once ridden in, and carrying the bronze horses of the hippodrome off to stand above a basilica in Venice, where they remain to this day. The house the bureaucrats had sworn to protect, they burned to the ground to keep one man off its throne. The judge Michael Attaleiates lived to see the ruin gather. He finished his history knowing exactly what his masters had done, and he set the truth down anyway, so that the brilliant lie of Michael Psellos would not be the only voice left standing. 1,000 years later, we are reading the judge, not the philosopher. That, in the end, is the only justice Romanos Diogenes ever received. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered and told without flinching, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with one person who needs to see it. Tell us in the comments what you make of Michael Psellos, the brilliant man who wrote the lie and then signed it with a blessing. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at the screen. A new video is rising into view. It is the next door into the darkest corners of the human past. Click it and keep going.